Robert Selig. So today, while scrolling through a few PubMed research articles, I came across this article called Structural and Functional Diversity of Estrogen Receptor Ligands. Basically, in a simple nutshell, and I'm just going to break it down to the meat and potatoes, but I found this article fascinating and intriguing because this is the stuff I've been harping on for the last decade or so. Now we're seeing this information is now showing up in these peer review articles. And that's why it got my attention because, like I said, I've been harping on this for over a decade. But in this article, they're talking about estrogen receptors, and what's influencing the estrogen and estrogen receptors are these xenoestrogens. And that's what this article is talking about. So let's get to it. Now, I want to simplify it because I don't want to make it so boring and live in this estrogen dominant world, because we know that we have normal age-related estrogens, shouldn't be a problem. We have the phytoestrogens coming from foods like flax, soy, hops, shouldn't be a problem. But what's changing the playing field, what's tipping the scale to an estrogen dominant population are these imposters, these fake estrogens. They look like an estrogen, smell like an estrogen, and metabolically behave like an estrogen, and they're referred to as the xenoestrogens. So let's look what this article says about these xenoestrogens. So xenoestrogens are synthetic chemical compounds that have been unleashed onto mankind, creating havoc within the environment, within the animals on this planet, and of course, affecting us. And they're coming from the titans of industry with no regard for human life, and their only motive is their bottom line, because they only have an alliance to their shareholders and their profits. They don't have an alliance to us, and it's wreaking havoc on human health. So these xenoestrogens mimic the action of endogenous estrogens in us and animals, and they interfere with cellular processes leading to serious implications on health. In particular, a large body of data suggests there is a positive correlation between the uptake of xenoestrogens and the development of breast cancers in humans. So they're just looking at breast cancer, but wherever you have an estrogen receptor, it could be in the brain, it could be in the bones, it could be in many, many organs and glands and the whole cardiovascular system. Wherever you have an estrogen receptor, this will apply. So the xenoestrogens, they broke it down into basically five categories. So in the 5 categories of these xenoestrogen, the first category is coming from what the doctors are prescribing the birth control pill, prescribing the hormone replacement therapy, and even tamoxifen is a xenoestrogen. The other broad category is the food additives, and the other category is the body cosmetics. Now, these 3 categories we have control over. We decide if we're going to pop the pill. We decide what foods we're eating. We decide what beauty products we're going to be using. You know, the makeups, the shampoos, the soaps, and all that lathering stuff. So we got to become more hip and wise to where these xenoestrogens are coming from. So these 3 areas we have control over. The 4th and 5th category of these xenoestrogens coming from the environmental pesticides, the gazillion of pesticides that have been unleashed onto mankind, covering every square inch of this planet. And the most notorious xenoestrogen is the atrazine. The atrazine is taking these male frogs and it's turning them into a female frog. We see this, if we can just extrapolate that information, we see it happening in us. If these xenoestrogens in utero, in our developing womb, can get lodged into the brain, causing the whole sexual thing that we're seeing in this country being played out, this dysmorphia of who we are as sexual beings. So this These xenoestrogens are a big deal. And then the industrial chemicals, and that's all your plastics and the whole plasticizer industry. So this nonsense has got to stop. But these are the 5 broad chemicals of your xenoestrogens. Now, the interesting part of this article is talking about the new emerging class of xenoestrogens called the metalloestrogens. Now, technically, I've been calling the metalloestrogens xenoestrogens over the last decade. I said it was the 6th category, but science, medical science, now has given these metalloestrogens its own classification because they are worse than the xenoestrogens. And these metalloestrogens are a big deal because metals move electrons. Electrons is how you get a chemical reaction to happen in the body. And these metals, because metals are not biodegradable. So we've heard of these forever chemicals, but worse than the forever chemicals are these metals because they're not biodegradable. When we're a corpse and we go through the crematory process, and in that crematory process, we have the ash. In the ash are the minerals and these toxic metals. Even through exposure to high heat, we still can't destroy them. Even we name the great cycles of time after these metals, such as the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. That's a 26,000-year cycle because these metals last forever, making them more pernicious and more insidious than the classic xenoestrogen, the chemical xenoestrogen. This is why the new emerging class are the metalloestrogens. So let's look at what this article had to say about these metalloestrogens. Heavy metal ions absorbed from various environmental sources mimic the action of endoestrogens. Those are your natural occurring estrogens that potentiate the transcriptional activity of estrogen receptors within the body. High levels of many of these heavy metal ions have indeed been detected in various tissues, including the breast, and there appears to be a direct correlation between their accumulation and subsequent development and progression of cancer. So they are estrogenic, these metals. And what metals are they talking about? They're mostly talking about these cation metals, which include aluminum, antimony, barium, cadmium, chromium, cobalt, copper, lead, mercury, and nickel. That's a big deal because when we're doing serial hair tissue analysis, we see these metals showing up all day long. So we know we have been inundated with these toxic metals. So we have to understand that they are influencing the estrogen. And as the estrogen bioaccumulates, that's going to also cause copper retention. So here we see they're calling out copper as it being, one of the metalloestrogens that have a severe estrogenic effect on human physiology. Copper happens to be the worst of these metalloestrogens because copper as a nutrient mineral is intimately tied to estrogen metabolism. So we know that throughout the history of studying copper and estrogen. So we know that in the ovulatory phases of a cycle, when a woman is ovulating, that's the highest peak of estrogen, that's the highest peak of copper. We know that when a woman's pregnant, usually around the 2nd, 3rd trimester, the estrogens double, copper doubles. So we know this intimate relationship between the estrogens and copper. And with all these xenoestrogens tipping the scale to become estrogen dominant, the estrogen dominant causes copper retention. So now we have copper in its influence on the estrogen, and now we have the estrogens causing the copper retention, and copper, because it's the most highly electrical metal in all of human physiology, because nothing moves electrons like copper. And the movement of electrons is how we get a chemical reaction. So the fact that copper and estrogen are intimately related, we can take a normal age-related estrogen, and through this copper accumulation, it can move the electron, adding a hydroxyl group on the wrong carbon at the wrong time, producing a malignant estrogen. So these toxic metals are a big deal, and copper is the worst offender of this. Now, that doesn't mean that cadmium is any better, or mercury or lead. They're all horrible, but just because copper's relationship with the estrogen really needs to be in our focus, because this is a big deal, because most of the cancers today are estrogenic. The reason why we have an obesity epidemic is because of the accumulation of these toxic estrogens building up. Because what does estrogen do in the body? Estrogens promote growth. In a normal setting, we love that. We want growth. But excess estrogens, excess growth, that's why we see the obesity, the fat growth, because that's what the estrogens are doing, promoting abnormal growth when it's in excess. And also it's linked to the acne, to the cysts, to the fibroids, to the cancers. So we have to become more aware of this. So the metalloestrogens are a big deal. You know, these heavy metal ions are coming from the titans of industry. And in this article, it's saying these toxic metals, they have an effect of the hyperactivation of the estrogen receptors is linked to the genesis of large fractions of breast cancers. And efforts are being undertaken to decipher the molecular basis of how these metalloestrogens activate estrogen receptors. So they're affecting these estrogen receptors through molecular mimicry, through ionic mimicry, and most importantly, displacing the zinc. So that's what I want to talk about next. So let's move on. So let's highlight a few of the key things in this article. DNA binding is accomplished through a pair of zinc fingers located within the DNA binding domain. And that becomes a big deal because it's the zinc that allows the hormone to bind to the ligand in this hormone ligand metal complex, so that can get into the cell nucleus to bind to the DNA binding domain. So that is fascinating because they're talking about the zinc fingers, and they're also talking about, let me highlight this for you in this article. So this was the part that I got excited about. It is, let me read directly from this article. It is noteworthy that environmental metals such as lead, arsenic, cadmium, mercury, copper can exert dramatic effects on the estrogen receptor. Here they're talking about the alpha receptor, the estrogen receptors, DNA interactions, by the virtue of their ability to replace the zinc within the zinc finger. So 10% of all your proteins are zinc fingers. So if these toxic metals displace the zinc, this is going to have profound effects on your steroid hormones. So that's what I want to highlight. Now, let me just kind of go over some things in this article. So here they have this diagram where wherever you see an estrogen response element, this estrogen response element is a hormone response element. You could take out the estrogen, you could put in thyroid hormone, testosterone, DHEA. Whenever you see a BDR receptor, a vitamin D receptor, that's the same thing as a hormone response element. A hormone response element is the zinc finger that's allowing the hormone ligand metal complex to bind to the DNA binding domain. So again, this is a stripped down version of the protein complex. It's just showing more of a alpha helix and a beta sheet, you know, and that's a tetrahedral coordination where it's bringing the two proteins to come together to fold into a three-dimensional shape. So this three-dimensional shape, which is this estrogen response element, can bind to the DNA binding domain. That's a big deal. And what did it say? These toxic metals displace the zinc. We know, I've gone blue in the face talking about 1 ion of mercury can displace 1,000 ions of zinc. Cadmium can displace hundreds of ions of zinc. Lead can displace hundreds of ions of zinc. Copper can displace the zinc. the atrazines, all these chemical and metals are kicking out the zinc. When you kick out the zinc, you're losing the zinc finger. So a zinc finger means it needs zinc. So in a zinc deficient state, you're not going to be able to activate your steroid hormones. That becomes a big deal. Let's move on in this article. In particular, a large body of data suggests there is a positive correlation between the uptake of xenoestrogens, that could be the chemical estrogens, that can be the metalloestrogens, and the development of breast cancer in humans. There is also growing evidence that these xenoestrogens may impact human male reproductive health. So this is what really got me excited, because we know sperm are loaded with zinc. That's the main driving force of your sperm. So we know when the sperm hits the ovum, science calls that the zinc spark of light. So it's that cosmic force, the cosmic force of zinc, allowing the sperm to have that explosion when it meets the egg, creating light. This is why we've always said that minerals are the spark plugs of life. So we know that the males in this country, the sperm count has decreased 50% in the last 50 years, and that's alarming. That's why we see that men are shooting blanks, and this is why we see fertility clinics in every city in our country, because we can't get pregnant. So we can't get pregnant because we're becoming deficient in zinc, because these toxic metals are displacing the zinc in the zinc finger. So let's look at that. So now I'm going to transition into a few of my slides that I've created, and let's look at that to drive this point home. So just to reiterate, we're talking about nuclear receptors. So all steroid hormones, thyroid hormones, fat-soluble vitamins are in this class of nuclear receptors. And that's your estrogens, your androgens, your progesterone, your mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, thyroid, and your vitamin A, vitamin D. So that's really a big deal. So let's look at how this is playing out. So in this picture, we see the zinc finger. So the zinc finger, it allows the alpha helix and the beta sheets to come together to fold into that three-dimensional shape. As it folds into the three-dimensional shape, then it can bind to the DNA. The sequence of the DNA can be read through the zinc finger protein complex, so it can coordinate what it needs to do within the DNA to transcribe and translate it into a usable protein. So that to me is really, it's the elephant in the room. We have hormones gone crazy. Everyone is Hashimoto. Everyone is, low thyroid, low testosterone, low DHEA, estrogen dominant, low progesterone, and across the board, low vitamin D. But yet no one's connecting the dot to zinc. And this explains how important is zinc is to take your zinc finger is needed to activate your thyroid hormones, steroid hormones, fat-soluble vitamins, so it can complex it with the hormone. And as it complexes it with the hormone, this is where the magic happens on the stranded DNA. On the stranded DNA, we have the terminal end of this nitrogenous base. We got the carboxyl group on the other end of the terminal end. We have a ligand binding domain. We have the trans activation domain. But this is where the magic happens in the DNA binding domain, is where the zinc finger and the protein complex binds right here for the magic to happen to give you a usable protein. So that to me is a big deal. Now, what also I wanted to mention is if that zinc finger becomes inhibited. So what can inhibit that zinc finger from that zinc to getting in there? any of these inhibitors. It could be atrazine, it could be glyphosate, it could be the gazillion other chemicals, and most notoriously, it's these toxic metals, these metalloestrogens, mercury, cadmium, lead, arsenic, copper, etc., are kicking out the zinc, displacing the zinc. So if the zinc isn't in this protein, the protein won't fold, and you lose the ability of this protein to bind to the DNA binding domain. That is a big deal. So this is where in cancer, let's talk about cancer for a minute. So the most researched gene in all of cancer is the p53 gene. It's referred to as the anti-cancer gene, the apoptosis gene. It's the guardian of the genome gene. It's the anti-cancer gene. It's the tumor suppressant gene. And at the center of this p53 is a zinc ion. The zinc ion allows this protein. Let me explain this in this picture. So again, this is a caricature of the p53 gene stripped down of many other things. So what we're seeing again is the alpha helix and the beta sheet coming together so it can bind to wherever you have a mutated strand of DNA. So the DNA is under attack from UV, from metals, from chemicals, from gamma radiation, whatever is causing the DNA to become mutated. You need the p53 to bind to that specific mutated part of the strand of DNA so it can do three things. It can stop the cell cycle, repair the mutated part, or it's going to go into senescent, or it's going to hit the apoptosis gene. That's the detonation button to blow it up, to delete it. So that's what this p53 gene is doing, and p53 is directly involved in 50% of every cancer known to mankind, and it's involved indirectly in 90% of all the cancers, whether that's upstream or downstream. Now, in this example, this is a gross oversimplification of genomics, of hormones, of the interaction of these proteins in the DNA, because I'm leaving out methylation, phosphorylation, acetylation, ubiquination, sulfation. So I'm leaving out many steps, but I'm trying to simplify this to give you the meat and potatoes, understanding how important zinc is, knowing that chemicals and metals displace the zinc, knowing that in our diet, the phytates, the oxalates, the fibers are irreversibly binding to the zinc so it never gets absorbed in the first place. So we become zinc deficient. When we're zinc deficient, what do we see? Hormones all over the place, deficiencies, estrogen dominant stuff, the cancers off the top shelf. You know, since Nixon waged a war on cancer, you would think cancer would have gone down. 1 out of 2.5 to 3 people will get a cancer diagnosis in 2025. So 1 out of 2.5 people will get a cancer diagnosis. Even though we've had a war on cancer since the 70s, yet cancer is skyrocketing, where it will probably overtake cardiovascular disease as the #1 killer in this country. So we got to become hip and keen to cancer and to understanding the toxic metal effect, the chemical effect, and how it's displacing the nutrient minerals. You know, even your big pharma understands the zinc finger. So in this book, Engineered Zinc Finger Proteins. So if you have a genetic disease, or you develop cancer or some autoimmune disease, they need to fix that DNA to repair it, and they understand that you need a zinc finger to attach their designer drug, whatever that designer drug is, to the zinc finger, so the zinc finger can read the sequence on the mutated part of that DNA to, in theory, to repair it or do something to it. So I'm saying, why don't we understand how do we detox these metals? How do we detox these chemicals? How do we focus on increasing magnesium and zinc in the body? Because magnesium and zinc are your DNA auditing system. So that's what I really wanted to talk about in this video today. Should you have any questions, just leave it in the comments section, and I promise to answer your questions. And once again, thank you for watching. If you're down here, pick you up.